Good morning, Talmina High School. We stand here this morning together on Gumbaynggirr land. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I would also like to pay respects to the elders, past, present and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge the sacrifice made by our First Nation service people who fought for a country which, in 1914, discriminated against them on a daily basis. The First World War was, in its time, the most destructive conflict yet experienced by humanity. When it began in August 1914, few imagined the course that it would take or foresaw its terrible toll. From a population of just under 5 million, more than 400,000 Australians enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force, the AIF, the force that Australia sent to war, and more than 330,000 served overseas. For most, this meant Gallipoli, the Middle East, or the war's main theatre, the Western Front in France and Belgium. More than 60,000 Australians lost their lives, a devastating toll for a small country. Yet they were a relative few. Around the world, some 10 million military personnel died in what was then called the Great War. Families and communities everywhere were affected by the enormous loss. When an armistice ended the fighting on 11th of November 1918, celebrations in the victorious nations were tempered by grief and sorrow. In Britain and the countries of her empire, the day's anniversary became known as Armistice Day. In 1919, and in every year since at 11 a.m. on 11th of November, people have paused to remember the dead. So great had been the loss of life, so devastating had been the destruction, that people hoped, even imagined, that the Great War would be the last war, the war to end all war. But it was not to be. 2 decades after the First World War ended, the world was plunged into a second global conflict. No longer could Armistice Day remain a day only to remember the dead of the First World War. After the Second World War ended in 1945, 11th of November became known as Remembrance Day. The day's sombre associations have never changed. When we pause at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November, we reflect on the price that Australia and countries around the world have paid through more than a century of war and conflict that followed the First World War. By observing 1 minute's silence, we pay tribute to the men and women who have served and are still serving in our defence forces, and remember those who have died or suffered in conflicts, wars and peacekeeping operations. Please stand as we will now recite the ode, listen to the last post and observe 1 minute's silence for the fallen. After the 1 minute silence, the rouse will be played. Please show your respect for the fallen with silence during this time. They went with songs to the battle. They were young, straight of limb, true of eye, steady and aglow. They were staunch to the end against odds uncounted. They fell with their faces to the foe. They shall not grow old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. Repeat after me, lest we forget. Please be seated. We will now show some videos that firstly explain the significance of Remembrance Day, and secondly, the important contribution that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have made during World War I and conflicts since then, despite facing discrimination at home. Each year at 11 a.m. on November 11, we remember those who died in World War I and commemorate those who represent Australia in conflicts past and present. This video provides a summary for the beginning of the Great War, the signing of the armistice, the effect of the war on people, and the importance of commemorating it each year. You will also discover the significance of the red poppy, who the Anzacs were, and the role of cenotaphs in local communities.
Each year in November, you may have seen these red poppies worn on people's shirts or shown on TV. Do you know what they are used to commemorate? They are a symbol of Remembrance Day. Remembrance Day is the commemoration of the end of World War I in 1918. But what's the story behind Remembrance Day? It all began with World War I, also known as the Great War, which started in 1914. It began when a bunch of countries, including Britain, France, and Russia, went to war against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Other countries, including Australia and New Zealand, also joined in to support their allies. The soldiers from Australia and New Zealand were part of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps and were called Anzacs. During the years of World War I, Australia and New Zealand were part of some really horrific battles that saw many people injured or killed, such as the landing at Gallipoli. Then one day, both sides agreed on an armistice, which is another word for truce. The signing of this agreement meant that the fighting would stop. So, at 11 a.m, on the 11th of November, the guns went silent after 4 years of continuous war. This was the moment that World War I ended. Because of this, the 11th of November is known as Armistice Day or Remembrance Day. Now, you might notice that the truce began on the 11th hour of the 11th day on the 11th month. This is why every year at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November, many countries around the world pause for 1 or 2 minutes of silence to remember those who have served their country in war. Did you know that in 1997, Australia decided to officially change the name of Armistice Day to Remembrance Day? This meant that the day recognised and celebrated any Australian who had served in any war or conflict. Now, back to those red poppies. Why are they so special for Remembrance Day? The red poppy was one of the first plants to come up through the grounds of the battlefields of World War I, making it the symbol of soldiers' sacrifice. Since 1918, Red poppies have been made using silk or paper and sold to raise money for those serving in war or those who have been affected by war, a tradition that continues today. During Remembrance Day, there are also many ceremonies held around the world to pay respects to those who fought in World War I. Maybe your town or city even has a cenotaph. A cenotaph is a monument built to honour people who were buried somewhere else. It's at these cenotaphs that people often lay wreaths and where gatherings take place on special days. The 11th of November is a special day to remember those who have fought and continued to fight for Australia. Maybe you can make your very own red poppy this Remembrance Day.
First Nations people of Australia fought in large numbers during world wars, despite the fact that they were legally barred from serving. Laws at the time meant that people not substantially of European origin or descent were not allowed to serve in the military. Those who could hide their Aboriginality, claim descent from another culture, or had sympathetic medical or other staff approve their registration were able to sign up regardless. Some people who were rejected from the army in one place then travelled elsewhere to try and sign up again. At times, during both World War I and World War II, these restrictions were relaxed to fill the need for more soldiers. Restrictions on enrolment in the armed forces based on race were finally removed in 1949. We will now watch a video about what enlistment in the AIF meant for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians and how unexpected equality was achieved in the trenches of the Western Front.
One of the opening songs in your play is about a world turned upside down. Is that what the service was like for Indigenous soldiers?
You have to imagine a world where Indigenous soldiers, well, Indigenous people, just didn't have the rights. It's hard to imagine 100 years on that the world was such an oppressive place for Black Australia. And so, not being able to earn money, not being able to be let into not just pubs, but, shops and all of these kind of things. To suddenly, when you signed up for the AIF and you volunteered, there was this amazing thing in the, the charter, I guess, of the AIF, that you had to be of substantially European background, I think it was. And you go, oh, what does that mean? And a lot of Indigenous soldiers were rejected early on. And then there were the two referenda, I think at the end of 16 and then in 17. And that's when you see a lot more Indigenous soldiers signing up. Well, not just signing up, being allowed to sign up. Because before then, the medical officer could say, well, we don't think you're substantially European enough, what's that mean? And so suddenly you had all these rejection forms saying not substantially European, not of significant European background, blah, blah. But after those referenda, a lot more Indigenous men are signing up. And there was no way of recording that they were Indigenous. There's no way of saying, oh, yes, this person's Indigenous, so therefore the way that the state treated them, this is Queensland or WA, remembering that the Federation was so new, that there were so many different laws still in place, that Indigenous soldiers were treated very differently by their states, but in the AIF were treated all the same. And the armed forces now like to say that they were the first equal opportunity employer in this country. So, I don't know, that's a bit funny to say, but this sense that they could earn money, they could travel, they were treated exactly the same. So this idea that the world was turned upside down, what was up was down, what was black was white, and that creating these units of men, I think one of the foundation stories of Australia is World War One. We think about the Gallipoli story, we think about the Anzac tradition, and this idea of mateship is really, if not formed, then really crystallized during World War One. And mateship in the trenches, in the front, in the desert, this whole idea that if there was a black soldier there, they were part of that mateship matrix. You couldn't extract one. They were all treated as equal. And I guess the beginning points of true reconciliation in this country, where we tried to understand each other and our stories. I like to say that if you are facing death together, then it's easier to live together. And that sense of how it changed. So for me, this upside down, world turned upside down song was really about saying, yes, how can a black man who's treated so badly in some ways then be treated as a hero in others?
Hopefully that's given you some insight today into the significance of Remembrance Day and also the experience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander service people who have served in conflicts around the world. That now concludes our commemoration of Remembrance Day. It is important that we remember to remember the sacrifice that Australians from all walks of life and cultural backgrounds have made in the service of this great nation. Please listen to your teachers before they dismiss you for recess. Thank you, Tormina High School, lest we forget.